Hello comrades, Eddie Liger here from Midwestern Marx. Today we're going to be discussing the history of the Chinese Revolution going all the way back to 1949 and leading all the way till today in 2021 when China has announced the eradication of relative poverty. But first, let's hear an introduction from Artsy Marxist, the newest member of Midwestern Marx.
Hi comrades, Artsy Marxist here. I was asked to give a little bit of a description for the inspiration behind my painting of Xi Jinping. This came about because of Xi's speech given for the 100-year anniversary of the CPC. I found it to be incredibly inspirational, especially his words pertaining to a vision of a world free from imperialism and from the bullying of the United States. On the podium where Xi gave the speech are 5 microphones. These 5 microphones are actually a metaphor. The Chinese word for 5 microphones, wu tong, is the same as the Chinese word for unifying by force, wu tong. So these 5 microphones are actually a metaphor for this vision of the Chinese people of a world to be free from imperialism. So I was sure to include that in the painting.
Thank you so much to Artsy Marxist for providing that awesome introduction as well as her incredible painting of Xi Jinping. We'll leave a link in the description to where you can find more of her stuff. And she's also coming on board now with Midwestern Marx, so hopefully you'll see more of her stuff from us here in the future. Let's get into the video then. Today we're going to be talking about the historical development of China and the Chinese Communist Party starting in 1949 with the Communist Revolution and the founding of the People's Republic of China by Mao Zedong. While much is said about China's political and economic systems in the West, oftentimes we neglect to study the historical development of their productive forces and political systems since their War of Independence. And that's what I want to provide today, at least in an abridged form, especially for Western leftists who don't always know how to interpret China. To start, I want to draw people's attention to a critique that Indian-based academic Vijay made of Western-based academic David Harvey at a recent forum intended to launch David Harvey's newest book. Vijay begins by announcing that 2021 was the 100th anniversary of the Communist Party of China to mixed reactions from the crowd. He then asks them to imagine that they had been born in India or China. India, the country Vijay's from, where poverty runs rampant, or China, the country who in 2021 announced the elimination of relative poverty. Those familiar with Harvey's work may already see where Prashad is going with this critique. For years, David Harvey has maintained that there is not a structure of imperialism that can be analyzed within capitalism. His reasoning for this being that wealth, military, and political power no longer solely exist in the West, but are also increasing in the East, particularly in China. Prashad is going to begin his critique of Harvey by invoking Ho Chi Minh, the revolutionary leader of Vietnam who led his people in a war of independence, before almost immediately being invaded and bombed to oblivion by the United States. Prashad says that for Ho Chi Minh, the most important thinker after Marx was Lenin, particularly Lenin's theories of imperialism. This is in contrast to much of the Western left who often dismisses Lenin as a less sophisticated thinker, maybe as somebody who led a revolution but who didn't understand and certainly didn't add to the complex theories of an academic like Marx. However, unlike Western academics, the theory of Lenin came from practice in trying to construct socialism after the Workers' Revolution in 1917. What Lenin found was that after the revolution, as the Soviets attempted to construct socialism, the capitalist Western powers descended on the workers' revolution with full force and did anything they could to disrupt and destabilize the construction of an alternate system to capitalism. Now, the theories Lenin came up with for combating imperialism were vitally important to thinkers like Ho Chi Minh or China's Mao, who we're going to be talking about today. After the revolutions in both Vietnam and China, the Western capitalist powers descended on the countries and did everything they could to destabilize them, just as they had done in Lenin's USSR. And because of this, the revolutions in Vietnam and China need to be understood as Leninist revolutions, revolutions against capitalist imperialism. And if the Western left continues to skip over Lenin and deny that there's a structure of imperialism within capitalism, they'll also misinterpret many of the things that the Leninist revolution in China is attempting to do. This is why Professor Prashad starts his talk by saying, "You just don't get it, guys. You live on the other side of imperialism." Western Marxists who say that the East is just as imperialistic as the West have never lived under the boot of imperialism to know how brutal it truly is.
It's easy for people in the United States to have this or that criticism of China, But you don't understand what it means to be born in a country that had been colonized and lived with a wretched old culture. You just don't get it, guys. You live on the other side of imperialism.
Lenin's theories of imperialism are entirely based in an attempt to expand upon the economic theories of Karl Marx. Marx observed that capitalism grows and spreads, and as it takes over more and more land, the capitalists will accumulate more and more wealth, which they can use to take over more and more land. This endless expansion of capital continued after Marx's death through the time of Lenin. Lenin added to Marx's theories the theory of imperialism, that as soon as capital takes hold of an entire nation and the capitalists in that nation begin to accumulate massive amounts of wealth via the exploitation of that nation's workers, the capitalists will then attempt to expand their capital and reach new markets by going into new countries. The capitalists will also use the state apparatus and the military to crush foreign nations and make them subservient to the wills of capital. And at Lenin's time, the most powerful capitalist nations were fighting each other over division of the colonies. One of the most important insights from this is that the productive forces in colonized nations do not develop the same way as the imperialist nations. The wealth, raw materials, and labor of these colonized countries are not used to develop themselves and their ability to produce everything that society needs, but instead these raw materials and labor are used to enrich Western multinationals who often aren't even based in the country being exploited. Lenin argued that this has various implications for colonized nations attempting to build socialism after revolution. First, the state must be seized and the armed bodies of the state must be used to defend against imperialism. After first shattering those armed bodies as a tool of capital and transforming them into a tool for workers, a country can't build socialism if it's immediately crushed by Western capitalists. Additionally, Lenin said that the productive forces must first be increased. Communism is impossible if a society cannot produce the material things that everybody in that society needs. Additionally, Lenin stressed and discovered the importance of the worker-peasant alliance. In countries where the productive forces are not as fully developed, those countries tend to stay agricultural and rely on ag production. Russia at the time of the revolution was semi-feudal, and China at the time of their revolution was almost a fully feudal country. While Marx argued it would be the industrial proletariat who led the revolution, Lenin said the industrial proletariat must ally with the peasants in the agrarian rural regions. This is because, of course, Marx was looking at Europe and England, where industrial capitalism had developed more fully and they had benefited from imperialism and colonialism. The worker-peasant alliance was vital to the Russian Revolution, and without it, the Chinese Revolution would have been absolutely unthinkable. The peasants were an irreplaceable element. You see how much practical importance these theories had to Mao as he attempted to construct socialism and combat imperialism. Or to Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam, a mostly rural country who was immediately invaded by the imperialist United States following their War of Independence. The Vietnam War absolutely obliterated their infrastructure and the soil used to grow crops, and probably the most important task of the Vietnamese after the war was to increase their productive forces so that they could produce everything their society needed. You see in real time through the example of the Vietnam War, the imperialist powers destroying the productive forces in a colonized nation, this time literally with bombs, and Agent Orange, and napalm. So now that we understand Leninist theory and the importance of increasing the productive forces in formerly colonized nations, we can start to understand the Chinese Revolution and the history of the revolution leading till 2021. Prior to China's revolution, they had faced constant interventionism and occupation attempts from Imperial Japan. Their people were purposefully subjected to opium addiction by the United Kingdom and other Western powers to make them more subservient and easier to exploit. A civil war against the Western-backed Kuomintang nationalists tore the country apart, and the mostly rural country was run by giant landlords who were basically feudal lords or kings left over from a past era. China would not have an easy path to socialism or to bringing themselves out of poverty. For those who don't know the history of China, their level of poverty at this time may seem incredible given the economic superpower that the country is today. But the real economic and productive base of China that has allowed for their growth into what we see today was laid under Mao. Many people wrongfully separate Mao entirely from his successor Deng, but this would be wrong. The policies which followed Mao would have been impossible without him. After taking power, the Communist Party of China had various specific goals. goals. The first goal was to consolidate support of the people, especially those who had supported the nationalists in the Civil War. The agrarian property relations needed to be changed. The land hoarded by these feudal landlords needed to be redistributed to the people. Additionally, they needed to prepare to expel imperialism and the invading capitalist powers while also increasing their productive forces and starting to develop their industry. The Revolutionary War had left China with very low productive output and very high commodity prices. Plus, everyone just hated these feudal landlords, so they had to go. So the Communist Party of China knew what their immediate goals were, but there was great debate within the party as to how to go about achieving these goals. The debate was essentially over whether they should have more or less economic planning centralized by the state. This would be similar to the policies of Joseph Stalin in the USSR, where productive inputs and outputs are heavily managed by the party. Others in the party wanted to do something more similar to Lenin's NEP, New Economic Policy. This would allow increased decision-making from individual firms and increase market activity and exchange. Eventually, the party went ahead with the ideas laid out in Mao's book on the People's Democratic Dictatorship. These policies would be closer to the Stalinist planning model than the more free market Leninist model. First, the landlords were gotten rid of and their land was redistributed. Many of them were executed or killed by the peasants who they had subjugated brutally for years prior. Peasant associations were formed to work the land, and party cadres were assigned specific rural areas to make sure that the party's planning efforts were being carried out in these agrarian regions. This meant increased cooperation in agricultural production, the building of irrigation systems to bring water to places that needed it, as well as the formation of mutual aid groups to bring food to places that needed food. The state provided a constant market, a constant demand for the agricultural producers to sell their crops to. This also increased the central authority that the party had in the country, as well as consolidating support exactly how they intended. Prior to these land reforms and progressions in agricultural production, famine and starvation were extremely common in China. The feudal landlords had been hoarding so much land that was used unproductively, and the goods were distributed so inefficiently that the changes made by the Communist Party bringing people out of starvation and hunger made them extremely popular with those people. When all was said and done, life expectancy in China under Mao increased 15.5 years. And it's almost hilarious to think about how this period in China's history is portrayed in the West. In liberal nations like the United States, the actions of Mao's government are considered authoritarian and dictatorial. As kids, we're often taught about the horrible killing of landlords that went on in China. Here's a book that my mom gave me about it when I became a communist. She had been warned about the policies of Mao in school. Only they left out the part about him increasing life expectancy 15.5 years, and they just portrayed him as a genocidal murderer. Right now in the United States, the majority of food production is controlled by giant agribusinesses. Capitalists and hedge funds who have never worked on a farm a day in their lives make the vast majority of the profits from our farming. Despite the fact that these corporate farms and American farms in general produce enough food to feed the entire world, 3 million people at least are allowed to starve to death every year. Seizing this land from capitalists and Wall Street speculators and redistributing it to agricultural workers and small-town farmers so that the food can be produced and distributed in a more effective and rational manner. This is what the liberal United States and liberal West in general considers to be authoritarian. Seizing agricultural land from people who are wasting it in order to feed people who are starving to death on a daily basis. This is authoritarianism in the liberal mind. In China, however, the land reforms were not viewed as authoritarian, and they helped to consolidate the support of the people behind the party. However, we've only covered a fraction of the developments that happened under Mao. Part of the issue of having an agrarian rural society is that you don't have much industry, the ability to manufacture and produce goods that aren't created in rural areas. The things that capitalist nations like the United States and England produce in mass in the cities, in the factories. The surplus product created by the agricultural producers was reinvested in developing the country's industry. Roads were constructed connecting the industrial cities to the agricultural villages. This allowed for easier transportation of agricultural product and food to the cities, and most importantly, allowing for the transportation of industrial machines from the cities into the agricultural area. This allowed for machine production and the industrialization of agriculture, which obviously greatly increased food output. Additionally, many people were given so-called backyard furnaces by the state to create steel. The main purpose of this was to train their population in industry and the creation of steel. In Capital, Marx pointed out that in capitalist countries, the workers of each generation are trained up by the workers of the past generation, who they learn from, always reproducing a working class. However, in China, an agricultural country with very little industry, there were not that many working class people who knew how to do industrial stuff. These backyard furnaces were mocked in the US as an epic failure of the Chinese Revolution and their attempts at economic planning and industrialization. Some of the agricultural and economic policies we've already discussed were part of the Great Leap Forward, the efforts launched by Mao and the Communist Party in 1958. During this time, China dealt with horrible weather conditions which greatly decreased their agricultural output. Mao's successor, Deng Xiaoping, would criticize Mao for the Great Leap Forward and announced that 16.5 million people at this time were killed as a result of Mao's policies, obviously attempting to increase his own popularity, which he did, taking over the party after Mao. As we've said, there was great debate raging in the party at this time as to what the best way forward was, a debate that Deng Xiaoping was a part of for most of Mao's era. Additionally, Mao encouraged criticism of his own policies and criticized himself for different things that were undertaken during the Great Leap Forward. As we've said, China's industry was not very developed and the quality of their industrial goods were pretty low. This led to dissatisfaction amongst consumers as well as among the agricultural producers who couldn't get a fair price for their own goods. There were also productive inputs that were wasted due to planning inefficiencies, although nothing close to the resources that were wasted under the feudal landlords of the past when famines were extremely common. Now, despite the complexity of this historical event, in the West, the Great Leap Forward is portrayed as one of the greatest acts of stupidity in human history, or an intentional genocide carried out by Mao to purposefully starve his people. More academic Western sources will generally posit that China over-focused on grain and industrial production, which led to an under-focus on other kinds of crops and agricultural production, leading to a shortage in food. While this narrative leaves out the historical development of China up until this point, as well as the weather conditions, it's not as bad as some of the other narratives. Some other Western sources argue that China's communal kitchens created after the revolution were just giving away too much food. The peasants just gave away all their food, and this is what happens when you give food to poor people. There's going to be no food left for the rest of us. This is why you don't feed poor people, okay? There's also a narrative that Mao gave an order to kill a specific kind of sparrow, which then led to a famine, killing millions and millions of people. And I'll let you guys either debunk or confirm that one on your own. I haven't finished my doctorate in the study of sparrows yet, but maybe in 2 years when I finish that, I'll be able to talk about this. Although the exact statistics surrounding the Great Leap Forward are unknown, Western academics have been able to extrapolate from data and bring the death count all the way up to 45 billion. But the record, as far as I'm aware, for attributing deaths to Mao goes to China Quarterly, a US-based magazine who was funded by the CIA. But it's okay, the editor of the magazine said that he forgot that they got all that CIA funding, so I'm sure they didn't let it influence their report. Some in the West will even go as far as labeling the Great Leap Forward as a genocide. A genocide where life expectancy increased 15.5 years. In reality, despite real mistakes, the Great Leap Forward was very necessary for China's process of collectivization and industrialization of agriculture. The backyard furnaces training their people in steel production, which the Western countries mocked, have grown into the largest state-run steel company in the world, which currently exists in China. While exact statistics on China are difficult to find from this time period, by the time Mao died, life expectancy had increased 15.5 years, literacy had increased 37%, housing had massively increased, infrastructure had started to be built, agriculture was continuing to be industrialized and collectivized, massively increasing food. Women's rights were written into law, and women's role in the economy increased massively in a way that would have been unthinkable before the revolution. The party had consolidated the support of the people, and most importantly, they had expelled the imperialist powers and kept themselves free from imperial and colonial domination. While they hadn't achieved full communism or abolished the commodity form, as many of their Western critics are eager to point out, Mao's revolution had made China free from imperialism and begun the increase of productive forces, just as Leninist theory had said. We see the importance of this Leninist theory in the practice of the Chinese Revolution and their efforts to increase productive forces, decrease starvation, and free themselves from imperial violence and domination. This brings us out of the era of Mao and into the era of market reforms and Deng Xiaoping, the so-called architect of modern China. Deng Xiaoping was born and raised in China, and for the majority of his adult life, he was an active member of the Communist Party. He became revered within the party for his military service, fighting against the Kuomintang nationalists, the Japanese occupiers, and in the Revolutionary War. Deng was an early supporter of Mao and was even demoted in the party at one point for his support of Mao. We've talked a lot about the fierce debate which is had within the party, which has changed and developed over time. Deng Xiaoping was heavily involved in this debate before the revolution and during the era of Mao. During the revolutionary struggle, Deng was for the most part a supporter of Mao. They even fought together and were both veterans of the Long March, where the Chinese army had to walk thousands of miles to escape the Kuomintang nationalist army. However, after coming to power, Deng would come to represent the more pro-free market, more liberalized section of the party. The sect of the party we talked about earlier who wanted slightly more privatization and market exchange as opposed to state central planning. Historians, especially in the West, often portray Deng and Mao as being diametrically opposed, as polar opposites in economic thought, with one preferring liberalism and the other preferring top-down economic planning. However, the two really just took two sides of a debate that was raging within the party, and at various times throughout the party's existence, they had been on the same side of debates. Towards the end of Mao's life, they were quite opposed, and Deng was exiled in the Cultural Revolution twice, as well as starting a political campaign blaming Mao for deaths under famine and claiming that his own policies could combat this. But it's not as if they were mortal enemies. They fought in the Revolutionary War together, and the policies of Deng would have been impossible without the policies of Mao that were laid down first. In fact, the stated goal of Deng's reforms were to deepen the policies of Mao, which had come before. Deng said that in order to do this, the country should open up specific financial zones to private investment from foreign firms. In the United States, this was hailed as the restoration of capitalism in China. But the goal of Deng Xiaoping and the Communist Party always remained the construction of communism, although they realized that this would be a slower path of construction than they originally had hoped for. Deng thought that the country needed to prioritize the continued development of their productive forces. He believed that without allowing some foreign investment, the country would be starved of skilled labor and capital needed to continue the productive development. Additionally, global financial systems like the IMF and World Bank had been set up post-World War II that gave the US increasing power over the global financial system. Having this control over financial systems has allowed the US to decrease financing to any countries who want to move towards socialism. Deng said that allowing investment in specific zones would allow the party to control the animal spirits of capitalism and stop capitalism from growing uncontrollably, while also allowing financing and capital to flow over the country's borders, where the party can manage it and redirect it towards increasing the country's productive forces while not allowing themselves to be choked off from global financial systems. Of course, this greatly increased China's role on the global stage and also gave them access to consumer markets. They've been able to make massive amounts of money manufacturing products and selling them on the global markets. The specific zones of financial investment were determined based on the foundation that had been laid by Mao. Where did the peasant associations and workers need more financing? Where did they need more capital? Where was there no access to consumer goods? These are the questions that went into determining how the reforms should be carried out, and it shows how the policies of Deng are inseparable from those of Mao. Of course, in the West, liberal media and academics declared that this was the restoration of capitalism, not a change in the path towards the construction of socialism. Even Michael Parenti, a Western academic known for his support of existing socialist countries, renounced his support for China and began critiquing them heavily. Mostly critiquing the elite group of capitalists who had formed in China, predicted by Deng, but also recognizing their increased economic growth. In 2005, the aforementioned David Harvey published a book entitled Neoliberalism, putting Deng Xiaoping's face next to Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, and Augusto Pinochet. Despite the fact that China has never wavered in their goal of building communism, the US was ready to announce that the goal of building communism had failed. And while I can't speak for Harvey and Parenti specifically, I think a lot of this in the West stems from our inability to look at things as a historical process. Liberalism and liberal academia often see events in isolation, as not being connected to the historical development which preceded them. Therefore, many liberal academics looked at Deng's market reforms and announced that capitalism had been restored, when in reality the goal within the Communist Party was to deepen the reforms of Mao and allow the construction of socialism to continue, not to stop it. And of course, the efforts to generate finance and capital through the global market without becoming prey of the US's economic warfare attempts through these financial systems like the IMF and World Bank is a continuation of the Leninist principle of fighting imperialism and avoiding economic domination from the Western powers. And many would argue that this is a necessity in the modern era. Famously in Chile, after the election of socialist President Salvador Allende, President Richard Nixon said, "Make the economy scream." The IMF and World Bank then cut Chile's financing from $200 million a year to $2 million a year. And of course, recently we've seen the devastating effects of US economic warfare and trade blockades on Venezuela, Cuba, Iran, and others. In 1972, the same Richard Nixon, who was attempting to strangle the economy of Chile, decided to visit China and spread goodwill. Western multinationals were now drooling over the profits they stood to make in China, and the US recognized the People's Republic as an independent country for the first time since their War of Independence. And Western multinationals have made billions of dollars in China, but they've had to play by China's rules, which hasn't always made them happy. Under the Trump administration, we saw China placed under a trade war, the same kind of economic warfare that the US has used elsewhere very effectively. And while the trade war did slow China's economy, they still remained the only economy in the entire world with an increasing GDP during the COVID pandemic. The US cannot strangle China the same way they've been able to do with other countries by blocking them off from global financial systems and global trade. Now, the goal of the market reforms was to continue the path of constructing socialism. However, this does not mean they don't come with risks. Allowing foreign multinationals and market reforms into the country was an increase in liberalization, which seems counterintuitive. How can you have an increase in liberalization that helps to build communism? Before enacting the reforms, though, the party was aware of the risks. After the reforms, China saw an increase in consumerism or petty bourgeois ideology. There was a class formed of wealthy business owners. The party has constantly had to fight against corruption. It's crazy. Capitalists try and control the government anytime you have capitalists. The risk that China took when opening up was the risk that these animal spirits, these market mechanisms, would entirely take over the country, and some people would argue that they have. But as Lenin said, when is it not risky to be a revolutionary? And all evidence from outside the Western hegemonic imperialist media shows that China is continuing their path to socialism. In the early 2000s, a CIA document said that China is still formulating. The CIA and the US empire did not yet know what to make of China. Western multinationals were making tons of money off the country, and it seemed like they were moving towards capitalism. Since that time, in the early 2000s, when the CIA said China was still formulating, we've seen the US basically cook up a new Cold War towards China. We had Trump's trade war, as well as Biden claiming that they were the biggest threat of the 21st century, whatever that means. I guess climate change doesn't exist. If the CIA thought in the early 2000s that China was still formulating, they must feel now that China has fully come into form. And that form is an anti-imperialist country who the US seems hell-bent on destroying or destabilizing. Today, in 2021, those backyard furnaces the Western countries used to mock that were intended to teach the Chinese people to make steel have become, through a long historical development, the largest steel company in the world, which is owned by the Chinese government. In today's China, the party cadres who used to visit the agricultural villages to make sure that food production was increasing and continuing to develop, now visit the villages to make sure that every citizen has electricity and Wi-Fi. The specific goals of the party have changed based on the level of development that their productive forces have reached. But today, as it was 72 years ago with the founding of the PRC, the goals of the party are to build communism and to serve the people. Serve the People is actually the name of a recent report put out by Vijay Prashad's Tricontinental Institute. The report, which everyone should check out, details the economic development of China since the revolution much closer than I've done today. If anyone wants to see in depth how the market reforms of Deng deepened the foundation that was laid by Mao, definitely check out this report. The report also covers the modern policies that have been carried out by China to continue increasing the productive forces, alleviating poverty, and building themselves up as an anti-imperialist power. The investment and spending of the Chinese Communist Party as compared to the imperialist Western countries like the United States truly highlights the difference in these two systems. In 2013, China spent $246 billion building hundreds of miles of roads in rural areas, bringing internet to 98% of the rural population, renovating over 20 million homes, and building over 9 million homes. These being part of the programs which in 2021 accomplished the eradication of relative poverty, an incredible achievement as global poverty has been increasing. Now let's compare China's spending in 2013 to that of the United States. As China was investing in these poverty alleviation programs, what was the US government spending their money on? In 2011, NATO, led by the US, would intervene in Libya, which cost $1.1 billion a day. The mission was supposedly to bring human rights, democracy, and freedom to Libya, but instead it destabilized their country and brought them from one of the most prosperous countries in all of Africa to a destabilized, impoverished country with an open-air slave market because they have no central government anymore. More of the US's spending in 2013 was revealed by recent leaked documents that showed they had spent $66 million on a propaganda campaign in Syria helping to cook up a new war. And when the US did decide to intervene in Syria, the war from 2014 to 2017 alone cost $12 billion. And that's just US spending. It doesn't include Syrian spending or the cost of the infrastructure that we've destroyed by constantly launching rockets into their country. And of course in 2013, as every year, the US funneled hundreds of millions to Israel to continue their occupation of Palestine. A few years later, Saudi Arabia would begin their genocide in Yemen, funded by US tax dollars. So while China has invested their money in infrastructure, roads, and poverty alleviation, the US has spent their money on bombs. Not only now are 78% of Americans living paycheck to paycheck as the country's infrastructure is crumbling, but poverty also increases anywhere the US decides to bomb or put under sanction regime. Capitalist imperialism has been increasing the level of poverty as China decreases it with investment and socialism. And this is why it seems so nonsensical when a Western-based academic like David Harvey claims there's no imperialism because China does the same thing. As the great Vijay points out, no, they don't. The East and the West are not identical. Just because China is increasing their wealth and they've increased their level of liberalization does not mean that they are a capitalist empire on par with the United States or anything close to it. China has not abolished wage labor, they have not abolished capitalism, they still have a very capitalistic, liberal economic system. However, they have carried out the goals of their Leninist revolution. The productive forces are increasing. They have become an anti-imperialist power who have completely avoided the strategies of domination that have been attempted by the Western imperialist capitalist countries. And while that's been happening in China, the US continues to look more and more like what Lenin describes in Chapter 8 of Imperialism, the parasitism and decay of capitalism. As capitalists outsource more and more manufacturing jobs to countries with low labor costs, good-paying jobs are outsourced from the US as the cost of living increases. As Lenin predicted, our economy became a rentier economy. The most powerful capitalists in our country are banks and real estate capitalists, people like Donald Trump who make money off your rent. So much manufacturing and production has been outsourced, with China investing in those jobs. The US has lost their position as a manufacturing superpower, and the country is now run by an oligarchy of rentier capitalists. China went ahead with these strategies in the first place because, as we've been saying this entire video, they were a Leninist revolution, a revolution against imperialism. And that revolution is alive and well in China today. Fidel Castro said of the current president of China, Xi Jinping, that he is one of the most capable revolutionaries Fidel had ever met. While it's of course difficult for us as Western leftists to get a grasp on foreign countries, given how biased and hegemonic the corporate media is, we must continue to attack the lies that the imperialist corporate media tells us about China in order to have solidarity with our Chinese comrades. It looks horrible for Western academics to be sitting in the wealth of imperialism talking about China as something it isn't. Attacking China for not yet achieving communism, whatever that means, as we sit in the US, the most brutal imperialist empire in history. Instead, we should have solidarity with our Chinese comrades and encourage them to continue developing their path to socialism. Additionally, we need to understand their revolution is what it is, a Leninist revolution against imperialism. And we need to understand our country for what it is, an imperialist capitalist country who has tried to hold countries like China in poverty for hundreds of years. We must remain critical, as the vast majority of our Chinese comrades are of themselves, but still support them and give them solidarity in their fight against imperialism here from within the imperial core. And most importantly, we must continue to struggle for socialist revolution here in the capitalist imperialist countries. And of course, the biggest thing we can do to help from here within the imperial core is to create socialist revolution ourselves. To begin constructing our own unique path to socialism and overthrowing the imperialist capitalist state and replacing it with a worker state. One who invests money in mutual development and poverty alleviation rather than keeping countries in poverty with bombs. An anti-imperialist country on the path to communism like China. Solidarity, comrades.